For years, I believed my life was something out of a dream. A beautiful home nestled in the quiet suburbs, 2 children who filled the house with laughter, and a husband whose smile, I thought, meant love. I was the kind of woman who worked tirelessly to make everything perfect: the house, the meals, the family image. Every morning, I brewed coffee while my husband read the news at the breakfast table, pretending to listen as I planned our day. My sister would often visit, bringing her careless energy into our well-kept home, filling the rooms with warmth. Or so I believed. Looking back now, I realize how every detail of that routine was crafted to keep me blind. The smiles, the gestures, the small moments that once felt comforting, they were rehearsed scenes in a play I didn't know I was part of. I thought my sister was simply close to my husband because she admired our marriage. I thought my kids adored her because she spoiled them with gifts and laughter. I thought she was family. But behind those moments, something darker was growing, something I refused to see. The affair didn't start suddenly. It began like a whisper, like dust collecting in corners you never think to clean. A harmless joke shared between them at the dinner table, a longer than usual glance. A late-night phone call my husband brushed off as work. The kind of signs you only recognize once your world has already collapsed. My sister Rachel was younger than me by 3 years, bold, carefree, and beautiful in a way that turned heads. She never settled, never cared about consequences. When she lost her job and needed a place to stay, I opened my doors without hesitation. I believed helping her was what family was for. I didn't realize I was inviting a snake into my home. During those months, my husband became a different man. He was attentive, kind, but distracted, always somewhere else in his thoughts. I blamed work, pressure, the kids, anything but the truth. And my children, innocent as they seemed, began to act strangely, whispering around corners, hiding phones when I walked into rooms. I thought it was just teenage mischief. I didn't know they were protecting their father's secret. It took 2 years before I saw it. 2 years of pretending not to notice how Rachel's perfume lingered in our guest room even after she moved out. 2 years of smiling through family dinners while my husband scrolled through messages he claimed were from the office. 2 years of trusting children who looked me in the eye and swore everything was fine. The truth didn't hit me like lightning. It came quietly, one afternoon when I found a photo on my daughter's old tablet, a picture of my husband and my sister at the lake house. The same lake house he told me he visited alone to clear his head. The timestamp was from a year earlier. My son's reflection was in the background of the photo, holding the camera. That was the moment my world began to burn. I remember sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at that photo until my hands went numb. The pieces of my life rearranged themselves into something ugly, the missed calls, the strange smiles, the excuses. Everything I thought was safe had been a lie carefully built by the people I loved most. But betrayal doesn't destroy you all at once. It peels you apart slowly. It makes you silent first. You learn to smile even when you're breaking. You move through the days pretending nothing's wrong, planning your next step while they think you're still blind. That night, when my husband came home, I watched him pour himself a drink, loosen his tie, and sink into the couch like nothing had changed. My children sat beside him laughing at some movie. I stood in the doorway, watching my perfect family framed against the light of the TV, a picture of lies. I didn't say a word. Not yet, because I wasn't going to confront them. I was going to destroy them, quietly, piece by piece. And it would all start with the one thing they never expected me to touch. Our home. The house had always been my pride. The manicured lawn, the sunlit porch, the row of potted geraniums I watered every Sunday. Neighbors had admired it, friends had envied it, and strangers had asked questions which I answered with a practiced, effortless smile. To them it was a simple suburban success story, a stable marriage, polite children, a tidy mortgage. To me it had been everything. Now it would become the instrument of a reckoning. When the photograph was found, time slowed in a way only a person on the edge of a choice can describe. 1,000 small decisions compressed into 1 hour of silent watching. I could storm the house, expose the truth, make them explain, force apologies. I could tear the family apart with immediate spectacle. That would be satisfying in a moment, but shallow in outcome. The people who had betrayed me were quietly calculating, adept at covering tracks and filing apologies like receipts. They would recover, they would reposition, and I would be left with remediation to a life already hollowed out. So I chose strategy. The house was the pivot. I had built a life that could be sold, leveraged, collateralized. It was the one asset that could humiliate them and leave them with nothing to hide behind. It was also the one thing they assumed I would never touch. No one expects a woman who cooks family dinners and arranges school art projects to turn domestic property into economic punishment. That assumption was my advantage. I began with observation. For a week I watched habits as though reading a map. I cataloged morning routines, credit card usage, the times they left the house and the times they returned. I learned the pattern of their excuses. I sat at the kitchen table, inside the room that had sheltered their secret, and I listened to the house breathe. There were creaks that spoke of late-night movements and vents that carried faint perfume from rooms where people pretended to sleep alone. My children moved like conspirators when I was present, their steps careful, their eyes lowered in a way that humiliated me more than anger could. They were not the innocent victims I had imagined. They had chosen allegiance. Next came paperwork, a world where I had always been competent. Spreadsheets and receipts and the small, domestic arithmetic of mortgage, insurance, and titles. I opened folders I hadn't touched in months. I studied the mortgage amortization schedule, the property deed, the line items for renovations. I read the small print of homeowner association bylaws and discovered penalties, transfer conditions, and potential loopholes. I discovered that the house's perceived value could be leveraged. I discovered that legal maneuvers exist specifically for the purpose of forcing a sale without a noisy courtroom drama. For the outside world, I had to be my usual self. Polite, distracted, the smiling matriarch. But inside I became precise, clinical patient. I restructured finances with the same coolness I used to arrange my daughter's birthday parties. I opened a separate account in my name and began transferring small sums from joint accounts into it, amounts undetectable to the casual glance but steady. I called mortgage brokers under the pretense of refinancing for renovation funds. I met estate agents with the casual curiosity of someone thinking ahead. Each call, each signature, was a stone in the foundation of my plan. There were practicalities to be engineered. The house had sentimental objects, photographs, heirlooms, things that could be used as charity fodder in the event of a scandal. The kids loved two things in particular: the old mahogany dresser that belonged to our grandmother, and the heirloom painting of the lake that hung above the fireplace. I moved those items in the dead hours, arranging them in storage units rented under aliases. The effect was twofold. First, it preserved whatever I intended to keep safe. Second, it created a theater of loss that would feel irreversible to those who had believed themselves entitled to everything. Parallel to these moves, I collected evidence. Not in the clumsy way of an enraged spouse, but methodically, legally. There were messages saved on devices, but raw digital proofs could be deleted. I used the human pattern instead. Witnesses, traces of spending, small admissions in casual moments. I watched bank statements for shared expenses that suddenly became personal. I gathered receipts sent to my home with unusual vendor names. I photographed the places they were photographed together. I archived these images with timestamps. I wrote notes to myself, factual, unemotional, almost forensic, recording times, dates, and places. This dossier was not for spectacle. It was an insurance policy that would allow me to negotiate from strength rather than from fury. The children's behavior was the cruelest puzzle. They were mine, flesh of my flesh, but their loyalty lay elsewhere. The youngest, a boy with a gift for mimicry, had been trained to shield. The eldest, quieter and more calculating, had become adept at diversion. I could have reacted with immediate cruelty, but revenge that robs you of your children's future is a hollow victory. So instead I manipulated the truth gently, planting seeds that would make them complicit in the outcome without destroying their prospects. I arranged for extracurriculars to appear suddenly more important, a needed tennis camp and demand art class. I signed them up for programs that involved deposits and schedules that required adult supervision at pickups. The aim was twofold: to create believable reasons for their being away on the day that matters and to create financial threads that showed my responsible investments in their future. When the sale eventually happened, I would argue that these deposits, these investments, and these extracurriculars were evidence of my prudent stewardship of family funds, spent, of course, as a parent, not as proof of betrayal. Neighbors have always been the unseen jury in suburban dramas. They watch the comings and goings, know the late-night cars, and remember anniversaries. I began to weave the local narrative quietly. I arranged to be seen in the right places, to attend community meetings and PTA events with a visible interest in the neighborhood's well-being. I smiled in the right way at the right people. Word travels in neighborhoods like an invisible current, and I intended for that current to shift subtly towards sympathy and away from suspicion. The house will be listed as part of a life decision, moving for fresh air, a new chapter, downsizing for retirement. Those phrases would be camouflage. They would hide the fact that I planned to sell and make sure my husband and sister were the ones who would have to explain why they were left without the facade they had cultivated. The first real move toward the sale was to create plausible deniability. I met with an estate attorney who offered language that could ensure I retained certain rights and protections. Discussions were framed as forward planning, my prerogative as a homeowner, nothing more. I signed documents that allow me to place the house on the market without immediate disclosure to the other occupants for a brief, legally permissible period. That small window of secrecy was my weapon. In it, I could list vet offers and accept the one that would strike hardest at those who had betrayed me. There was a cruelty in the precision of my actions that singled me out from the type of woman I had been. But cruelty, I learned, is sometimes just a mask for survival. I was no longer trying to survive daily indignities. I was engineering a permanent solution. I scheduled open house viewings for a weekend when my husband and children would be away on the contrived extracurriculars. I scrubbed the home to a level of antiseptic perfection, leaving no traces of the life we had staged. I staged photographs for the listing showing a life of tranquility and stability, the very thing they had pretended to have. It felt like lying to the world, but it was a strategic lie that would allow the world to make judgments to their detriment. As listings went up and agents whispered about interest, the house took on a strange new personality, not my home anymore but a commodity in a public market. I watched commentaries from strangers who admired the granite countertops and the original hardwood floors. I played the part of the calm seller, and inside I was cold as winter. There is a clarity in watching one's life disassemble into a transaction. Emotions become line items. Memories become decor choices. The people who had used my love as a cushion were about to be unmasked before the same neighbors who had praised our perfect domestic life. But plans rarely run without friction. My husband noticed subtle changes, new questions about bank statements, the oddity of storage unit rental notices delivered to the house, the refined professionalism of real estate photographs placed on community forums. He tried to ask. I deflected. He tried to probe. I smiled. My sister sensed danger like a cat feels a storm. The children, trained to hide, chafed. The eldest began to push, to ask direct questions in moments when I least expected it. I answered with banalities, a fresh start, the kid's future, the best decision for all. Each answer was another layer of the performance that would culminate in my advantage. The real tension built not from the act of putting the house on the market, but from the way in which the environment around us changed. Neighbors who had once waved now stopped to exchange a twinge of sympathy. Mothers at the school drop-off, who had always admired my garden, now lowered their eyes as if offering quiet condolences. The community assumed a narrative for us, a family moving on, a woman choosing herself. That narrative was ambiguous enough to be comfortable for them and damning enough to complicate my husband's lies. Public perception, once it began to tilt, became part of the pressure cooker. Every morning I woke with the same thought: property is more than wood and brick, it is a ledger of trust. By transforming it into a controlled sale, I would convert betrayal into a measurable, irreversible consequence. I would not only humiliate the pair who had conspired to steal my life, I would remove their buffer, leaving them to face a reality with no family property to hide behind. The children would have a home to lose and a lesson burned into their memory that loyalty can be purchased and withdrawn. When the first offer came, it was modest, a sensible family wanting a calm suburban life. I could have asked for more, negotiated, or pulled the listing to coax a better price while giving them more time to wriggle. Instead, I accepted an offer that was public enough to be embarrassing, private enough to be legal, and timely enough to strike when the betrayal was still raw. The buyers seemed oblivious to the human wreckage their deposit represented. They saw a beautiful house at a reasonable price. They saw nothing of the secret that had been seeding the walls for years. I signed the papers with a hand that didn't tremble. Standing there in an office where neutral voices discussed escrow and transfer, I felt sympathy for no one. The house that had shielded their deception had been converted into ledger lines that would disarm them. The legal machinery moved with indifferent efficiency. That efficiency is a kind of mercy. It makes everything a matter of dates and signatures rather than the messy tangle of feelings. That night, the invisible architecture of our lives had shifted. The house was under contract. The dates were set. The children might come home to find a world rearranged, a piece of constancy removed. My husband sat on the couch with his phone in his hand, the million tiny lies inside it suddenly less useful. My sister called from somewhere I did not ask about, and I let the voicemail go unheard. The small cardboard boxes in the storage unit hummed like a physical tally of what I had taken. I slept like a person who has finally given name to a long, slow-burning grief. And yet, even as victory felt near, I knew the hardest parts were still to come. Selling a house might strip them of shelter and status, but it could not remove the web of relationships, the legal complications, or the way the community would pick through the details. This was not an ending. It was an engineered upheaval that would cause consequences for them, for the children, and for me. I had set a trap with finesse and patience. Now I had to watch as the world reacted to the fallout I had orchestrated. The moment a house becomes a line on a contract, it acquires a new kind of gravity, one measured in dates, signatures, and the small print that people rarely read until it is already too late. I had expected resistance, calls, anger, pleas. I had not expected the ingenuity with which lies could multiply under pressure. The people I had loved most were suddenly resourceful in their own defense, and their resourcefulness revealed truths about them I had not wanted to know. When the sale went public, it moved through the neighborhood like wind through dry grass. Conversations shifted away from garden advice to clandestine whispers about inspection dates and closing costs. The PTA mothers whose faces had once been framed by polite smiles now offer sympathetic nods and careful condolences. Sympathy is a currency in small towns. It buys the right to judge without being accused of cruelty. I let it circulate, it was part of the camouflage. Behind that polite exterior, the machinery of consequence kept turning. The first paper that mattered arrived with bureaucratic neutrality, the inspector's report. They called it an objective document, an accounting of physical facts, cracked tiles, a leaky gutter, a furnace that needed service. But in my mind it was a mechanism for time. The inspector's appointment had been scheduled for a day when my husband believed his sister would be visiting, and my children had been encouraged to spend the afternoon at the art camp I had enrolled them in. The house was empty, staged, and perfectly unmarked. The inspector walked through rooms that had contained our life and took notes like a stranger cataloging a relic. My husband noticed the changes faster than I expected. The receipts that had once been shared now showed new recipients. The credit cards used at odd hours had lines of explanation I had prepared in advance, legitimate expenses for the kids, investments in their futures. He tried to reconcile his own story with the ledger I had been assembling. He plotted and prodded. He called old friends, queried mortgage details, and attempted to find a way to stall the process. His attempts were a flurry of impotent gestures, the kind of gestures men make when they are used to being the actor rather than the acted upon. My sister reacted differently. She moved through the house like someone measuring how many rooms she could still claim as hers. She sent messages I read later, polite and venomous all at once, implying betrayal and asking how I could be so cruel. She threatened the repercussion of scandal if I proceeded. Threats are only valuable when they can be made public. She had spent 2 years hiding in plain sight. She had no appetite for exposure now that the consequences would be tangible. The children's behavior hardened in ways that would bruise. The eldest stopped meeting my eyes, as if avoidance could erase responsibility. The youngest, who had been playful and reckless, grew solemn and watchful, learning early the art of censoring his own face. They started to keep secrets inside their mouths the way some people keep jewelry in the hollow of a pillow. I was their mother, and yet I had become a stranger who could take away the roof over their heads. That realization, cold and sharp, was my punishment as much as anyone's. Legal threats arrived like a winter storm. Letters from attorneys, terse and professional. My husband's lawyer claimed irregularity, suggested mediation, and insinuated that the timing was suspicious. An attempt to deprive a family of its home. I had anticipated this line. The attorney's claim was a predictable stage in marital theaters. I met those threats the way I had met the lender's forms, with documents, receipts, and a calm that made the lawyer's words seem theatrical. I had retained an attorney who understood how to translate emotional harm into contractual terms. He turned threats into motions that had to be filed within defined timelines, and for each motion I had an answer. But law is not only written. It lives in the small intentions of people who file paperwork late, who forget to notarize documents, who miss a deadline in a moment of human distraction. I watched their panic produce mistakes. A hastily prepared affidavit, an improperly notarized signature, human stumbles that the law mercilessly capitalizes on. In the quiet of evening, I would find evidence of their desperation. A printed email left open on the kitchen island. A list of potential witnesses crumpled on the counter. They were scrambling, and their scramble left traces. My files were organized. Their disorder was its own confession. I did not revel in the pain I caused my children. I had imagined earlier that the only feeling I would have was satisfaction. That was a vanity I could no longer afford. There were nights when the house was empty and I walked through rooms that still smelled faintly of family life and felt a hollow ache that no legal victory could soften. A mahogany dresser I had hidden away had belonged to my grandmother. Its drawers were full of letters and small folded photographs. Each photograph was a miniature betrayal of my resolve, because it showed my children as children, innocent before they chose to be complicit. I kept those photographs in a locked box and looked at them when I needed to remember they were not irredeemable. The community, however, had begun to tilt in a way that bounded the space around my husband and my sister. Wordless things, like the reluctance of a neighbor to host a barbecue with them or the absence of invitations to coffee, accrued into social isolation. People do not like to be on the losing side of gossip. They prefer to be with the person perceived as morally right. That shift was not immediate, but it was cumulative. The husband who had once been admired for his presentations at the local Chamber of Commerce found fewer colleagues at networking events. My sister's visits were met with cooler greetings. Subtle, quiet penalties accrued that no legal document could address. Their attempts at sabotage took shapes I did not expect. My husband tried to spread rumors that I was unstable, that I had a gambling problem, that I had been reckless with money. Smear tactics are as old as marriage. They aim to protect reputation by ruining the accuser. I anticipated this and had my own counters prepared: bank statements, savings balances, proof of the careful investments I had made for our family. The truth, in its prosaic detail, can be a formidable defense against character assassination. The more he lied, the more he exposed himself to the look of someone grasping at straws. There were moments of realignment that surprised me. An old friend of my husband's, someone who had known him before we married, showed up with a small bag of supporting documents, texts, receipts, that eroded the carefully constructed alibis. It was a quiet betrayal of his loyalty to my husband, but a welcome alignment in my cause. People are unpredictable that way. Loyalties can shift when what was once admirable becomes shameful. I did not force the hand. I accepted that the truth had a way of encouraging allies. At the center of this legal battle was an ugly arithmetic, the timeline of 2 years of secret meetings, the cost of vacations taken in places where explanations were thin, the small recurring transfers of money disguised as family loans. These numbers, presented plainly, had an uncomfortable clarity. They told a story that was visible to anyone who cared to look, that my husband and my sister had invested in each other in ways that excluded me. Numbers are not vindictive. They are stubborn. They prove things people prefer to deny. Yet the fight was not only about proving an affair. It was about the division of daily life. Who gets custody of shared memories, who keeps what remains of dignity, and who gets to walk away without consequence. I had expected legal battles to be clinical. Instead, they were pierced with human petty cruelties. My husband attempted to weaponize my past kindnesses, pointing to the times I had helped his career or consigned loans, suggesting that I had been irresponsible. He portrayed himself as a sympathetic figure who had been seduced by a family crisis. The narrative was thin and desperate. For every spin he made, I had documentation that showed prudence, poetry of budgets and receipts that trace a life lived honestly. Consequence is not only a matter of loss. It is a recalibration of identity. As the court dates approached and meetings multiplied, I felt my identity shift from betrayed wife to strategist, from a woman of domestic rhythms to someone whose mind had learned the language of contracts. That transformation was disorienting. I mourned the version of myself that had baked pies and sewn costumes for school plays, yet I recognized the necessity of evolution. Survival sometimes asks you to become a person you might not have admired before. When mediation was proposed, I agreed to sit at the same table as them only once. I wanted no theatrical confrontation, no desperate exchanges that might be later twisted and paraded as evidence that I had been unstable. The mediation room felt narrow and bland, designed to mute emotion with beige upholstery. Each of us sat with our attorneys, and the conversation when it began was mercifully clinical. Numbers, not feelings, guided it. My husband's attempts at theatrics reduced themselves in that room to numbers on paper. The mediator, bored with the melodrama, guided us like a referee who had little patience for drama in professional settings. In the end, small lies proved to be less useful than cold arithmetic. He could scream and plead outside the legal framework, but inside it he could not easily refute ledgers and receipts. The mediation produced a settlement that redistributed assets and responsibilities in ways that left him with less than he had expected. My goal had never been to make him destitute. It had been to make him accountable. The settlement did that. It removed the house from his safety net and made his financial decisions more transparent. Yet settlements carry their own costs. The children, now aware of the legal resolution, retreated inward. Their world was being divided into official lines and forced choices. They would live with consequences longer than any of us would like. I had engineered this outcome with calculated resolve, and now I had to live with the echoes in small faces that had once smiled at me without hesitation. When the legal dust settled enough to allow for a closing date to be set, the house felt different. The wallpaper had the same floral print, the hardwood the same grain, but there was a new stillness to the rooms, an awareness of being observed by strangers showing up for viewings. I walked through each space one last time emotionally, cataloging the places where small betrayals had taken shape. I thought of leaving something behind as a lesson, some artifact to remind them that actions have costs. Instead, I took nothing, choosing to leave the physical memory blank so that the absence itself would be a curiosity. Absence can be an indictment as sharp as any accusation. And so the chapter closed on paper, signed documents, sealed envelopes, a date that would mark the end of a domestic era. That date would not erase memory or mend broken trust, but it would make consequence real. In the quiet that followed, I found myself facing an unexpected and raw feeling, not triumph, but the slow ache of having remade my life on the bones of what I had lost. After the signatures dried, and the house was no longer legally mine, the silence that settled was unlike any I had ever known. It wasn't the kind of silence that follows peace, it was the silence that follows a storm. The kind that hums with residue, with whispers of destruction still echoing through walls. Though I had executed my plan with precision, there was no victory parade, no grand satisfaction. There was only the dull realization that revenge, even when cleanly delivered, leaves behind an emptiness that refuses to be ignored. The neighbors, of course, filled that silence with talk. In the weeks following the sale, my name floated through the neighborhood like dust, quiet, constant, inescapable. They spoke in fragments. She sold the house out from under him. Did you hear about the sister? The kids are staying with their father, poor things. The polite smiles at the grocery store carried questions they would never ask aloud. Everyone wanted to understand what had happened, but no one wanted to risk hearing the truth. Scandal is most comfortable when it remains a rumor. I walked through those streets with my head held high, pretending their curiosity didn't exist. I had learned that in suburbia, composure is more powerful than any explanation. The women who once envied my life now looked at me with a strange mix of fear and fascination. In their eyes, I was no longer a wife betrayed. I was a warning. A reminder of what happens when you underestimate quiet women. The house itself became a kind of monument to the story. The new family who moved in, polite, smiling strangers, had no idea that the walls still carried ghosts. I drove by once, not to spy, but to confirm the finality of it all. The porch was newly painted. The garden I once tended had been redone, my geraniums replaced with neatly trimmed hedges. The sight was almost merciful. It looked like the kind of home I once thought I had. But that illusion belonged to someone else now. For my husband and my sister, the fallout was slower and crueler. Their affair, once hidden, had been dragged into daylight by consequence rather than confession. He lost credibility in the community he had once dominated. People who once invited him to golf tournaments now avoided him. My sister, bold, defiant Rachel, found that whispers cling longer to women than to men. She tried to move away, but reputations travel faster than people do. Every new neighborhood, every new job carried shadows of the same story. Isn't she the one who? The affair that once made them feel powerful now made them both smaller. And my children, they were caught in the crossfire of silence. They stayed with their father after the settlement, though not by my demand. It was their choice or perhaps their guilt that kept them there. They called occasionally, always politely, their voices careful and distant. The youngest would sometimes break the facade, his voice trembling with something unspoken, but before words could reach honesty, his father's presence would cut the call short. I didn't push. I knew time would do what I could not. Truth, once sown, grows on its own. In the stillness of my new apartment, I began to build something different. Smaller, quieter, more honest. The furniture didn't match, the walls were bare, but the space belonged entirely to me. I had no one's secrets to clean up after, no one's phone to pretend not to see. At night, I could hear the faint hum of city traffic, a noise that sounded like freedom. I didn't miss the house. I missed the version of myself who had once believed in it. The neighborhood, though I had left it behind, didn't leave me. Stories have a way of looping back. A friend from the old PTA called one afternoon, pretending to check in but really calling to relay gossip. She said my husband had tried to sell his car to pay off debt, that my sister had taken a job in another state but quit after a few weeks, that the children looked unhappy. I thanked her, but her words didn't bring pleasure. I had thought their misery would feel like balance, that seeing them lose what they valued would fill the void they created in me. But vengeance, I learned, is not a currency that pays in peace. It buys only quiet. Still, that quiet had value. It gave me clarity. I began to see the pattern of what my life had been before everything broke. It wasn't perfect, it was performative. A performance for neighbors, for social media, for the illusion of family. I had mistaken routine for security, love for comfort, trust for convenience. The betrayal didn't create that illusion, it merely exposed it. I started volunteering at a local shelter. Not out of guilt, but because I needed to rebuild some connection with humanity. The women there came from different worlds, some beaten, some bankrupt, some simply lost. But they shared a common thread. They had all been deceived by someone they loved. In their stories, I heard echoes of my own. And in helping them, I began to forgive myself for the years I had lived blind. Occasionally, I would see the old neighborhood mentioned in community newsletters, new development projects, street festivals, school fundraisers. My name never appeared, but I didn't need it to. I existed now outside of that geography, beyond those small maps of belonging. They had kept me confined once. Now I was unbound. Yet, one evening, as autumn began to thin the trees, I received an envelope in my mailbox with no return address. Inside was a single photograph. My children, standing in front of the house that was once ours, holding hands. Behind them, the porch light glowed faintly in the dusk. Written on the back were 4 words, in my daughter's handwriting: "We finally know everything." I sat for a long time staring at that picture. The ache that rose in my chest wasn't pain. It was release. Maybe they had discovered the truth, the full, ugly truth of what their father and aunt had done, and what I had done in return. Maybe they had seen through the lies that had kept them prisoners of guilt. Or maybe they had simply grown up enough to understand that justice, even when brutal, can be love in disguise. I didn't call them that night. I didn't respond. Some truths, once understood, don't need to be discussed. They only need to be carried forward. That photograph now sits framed on my nightstand. Not as a reminder of what I lost, but of what I reclaimed, my clarity, my autonomy, my silence. The echoes in the neighborhood faded, but the echoes within me became steady, resolute. I no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. My story had already been told, written in property deeds and whispered across lawns. What mattered now was that I owned my ending. And for the first time in years, that was enough. When people imagine revenge, they imagine fire, something fast, blinding, and decisive. They never imagine the slow burn that follows. The quiet that stretches for months after the flames have died. The taste of ash that lingers in your mouth long after justice has been served. I learned that vengeance doesn't end with victory. It ends with silence, and silence has its own kind of cruelty. The months after selling the house were strangely weightless. There were no phone calls from the bank, no neighbors waving from across trimmed hedges, no children's footsteps down the hallway. My new apartment overlooked a parking lot instead of a garden. The air smelled faintly of asphalt and rain, not flowers or cut grass. I told myself I didn't miss the old house, but sometimes my body remembered before my mind could resist. The way morning light once filtered through the kitchen blinds. The sound of the kettle whistling just before dawn. Ordinary things, stripped of the people who had poisoned them, still carried their ghost. I woke each morning to a life unrecognizable and painfully clean. There were no lies left to discover, no deceptions to decode. Only truth, raw, steady, and unchanging. And truth, I discovered, can be just as heavy as betrayal. At first, I kept busy. I reorganized my finances, cleaned the apartment until it gleamed, even took on freelance design work from home. It was easier to drown in tasks than to confront the echo of loneliness. But night has a way of stripping away distractions. The evenings were the hardest. The apartment would dim, and I'd sit by the window with a cup of tea, staring at the blurred lights of passing cars. Sometimes, when a family walked by below, a couple laughing with their children, something inside me twisted. It wasn't envy, it was recognition. They still believed in the illusion I had lost. News of my husband and sister reached me in fragments. My sister had moved again, another city, another attempt at reinvention. But reputation is like perfume. It clings long after you think it's faded. No matter where she went, people learned. And my husband, his life was unraveling with slow precision. The company he worked for began investigating his finances after rumors surfaced about his misuse of business funds. Whether it was true or not didn't matter. Once doubt enters a man's reputation, it spreads faster than proof ever can. I didn't orchestrate that downfall, but I didn't stop it either. The children stayed distant, though not absent. The phone calls were shorter now, polite, rehearsed, almost administrative. "We're fine, Mom. School's good. Dad's busy." They spoke like diplomats, not like children. I wanted to tell them they didn't need to protect him anymore, that the truth had already done its work. But I also knew that their silence was survival, their way of balancing love between two parents who had both waged war in their own way. It was in that loneliness that I began to understand what I had truly done. I hadn't just taken a house. I had dismantled an ecosystem, the fragile web that holds a family together even when the love inside it dies. Revenge had given me justice, yes. But it had also demanded a sacrifice I hadn't anticipated, my peace. Every act of retaliation had been fueled by precision, not hatred. But when the dust settled, I realized that hatred had quietly taken root anyway. It lived in the smallest things, the way I distrusted kindness, the way I scanned every face for deceit, the way I flinched at the sound of laughter that wasn't mine. I had built my revenge with the same care one builds a home, and now I had to live inside it. Weeks turned into months, and the world slowly forgot the scandal. The neighborhood moved on. New stories replaced mine. New betrayals, new divorces, new gossip. The suburb had a short memory. Everyone's tragedy was entertainment until the next one arrived. But memory lingers differently for those who lived it. I carried mine like a scar that no longer hurt, but still demanded attention. One afternoon, while sorting old papers, I found the folder labeled House Sale Final. Inside were the closing documents, the deed transfer, and a printed copy of the property listing. The photograph of the front porch stared back at me, clean, bright, deceptive. I traced my finger over the picture, remembering how that porch once held my children's laughter, my sister's betrayal, and my husband's lies. Then I tore the page in half, slowly, deliberately, until the image no longer resembled a home. It was then I understood something I hadn't before, that revenge can destroy the object but never the memory. You can sell the house, but not the years you lived in it. You can erase names from deeds, but not from the corners of your mind. Healing, if it comes at all, comes not from erasure but from endurance. And endurance, I learned, is quieter than vengeance. As winter crept in, the loneliness softened. I started going for walks at night, through quiet streets where no one knew my story. Sometimes I stopped at a nearby park bench, watching the wind stir the leaves. I didn't feel guilt for what I had done. Guilt implies regret. What I felt was recognition of who I had become, and the distance between that woman and the one I used to be. One evening, I received a message from an unknown number. It was my son, Mom, Dad sold the car, we're moving. He says he can't afford this place anymore. There was no anger in the message, just resignation. And then another, I think we finally understand. I stared at those words for a long time. I didn't reply. There are moments when silence says everything, when words would only cheapen the truth. My children had seen the cost of deception with their own eyes. They didn't need another lecture about morality or justice. The world had taught them in ways I never could. In that silence, I felt something shift. The ache that had followed me for months, the one that used to tighten my chest every morning, began to ease. Maybe forgiveness wasn't an act of kindness toward others. Maybe it was simply a form of self-preservation. I wasn't ready to forgive them yet, but I was ready to stop carrying the anger like an heirloom. By spring, I had started painting again, something I hadn't done since college. The first canvas I completed was simple, a house by a lake, surrounded by overgrown grass, the windows dark, the water still. It wasn't the house I had sold. It was the house I had escaped. When I finished, I signed the corner with my initials and hung it in the hallway, not as decoration, but as closure. The price of revenge is never paid in money or property. It's paid in the nights you spend remembering what peace used to feel like. It's paid in the quiet moments when victory feels indistinguishable from loss. It's paid in the parts of yourself that you can never get back. But sometimes, when you look at what remains, you realize the cost was worth it. Because at least now, what's left is yours alone. Time, I discovered, doesn't heal wounds. It merely dulls the edges so you can carry them without bleeding. Months passed in a quiet rhythm, each day unremarkable yet steady. I no longer woke with the bitterness that used to tighten my chest. Instead, there was a calm detachment, as if I had stepped outside my own story and was now watching it from a distance. The woman who had once sold everything in a storm of betrayal now moved through life with deliberate stillness. My apartment had begun to feel less like exile and more like belonging. The furniture, mismatched and modest, had gathered its own kind of warmth. The smell of fresh coffee in the mornings replaced the scent of roses from the garden I once kept. I didn't crave perfection anymore. I craved authenticity. Every imperfection in this small home was mine, and for the first time in years, that felt like peace. The letters from my children started arriving in spring. At first, they were brief, cautious sentences written with the restraint of people afraid to reopen a wound. We're doing fine. Dad is looking for work. School's okay. I would read each line slowly, as though decoding something beneath the words. There was always an unspoken question hidden between them. Do you still love us? And though they never wrote it, I answered it silently every night before sleeping. Then one day, a longer letter arrived. The envelope was creased, the handwriting uneven, my daughter's, I recognized instantly. It began awkwardly, with formal politeness that broke halfway through into confession. She wrote about the years of secrecy, the weight of lies, and how protecting their father had felt like survival at the time. She said they had both believed they were preventing pain, that if I didn't know, I wouldn't be hurt. But secrets, she said, had a way of becoming prisons. She ended the letter with a sentence that took my breath away. You didn't destroy our home. Mom, you freed us from it. I sat at the kitchen table for hours after reading that, the paper trembling in my hands. For 2 years, I had imagined my children's silence as judgment, their distance as punishment. But it wasn't anger that had kept them away. It was shame. They had lived with guilt, just as I had lived with betrayal. And now, years later, the silence between us had become the only inheritance we all shared. A week later, they came to visit. It was a Sunday, bright, gentle, with the kind of air that carries the scent of new beginnings. When they arrived, they looked older than their years. My daughter, now 17, had her mother's eyes but her father's careful posture. My son, 16, stood taller than I remembered, his expression unreadable. We stood in the doorway for a moment, 3 people bound by the memory of a home that no longer existed. There were no apologies, none spoken, at least. Instead, there was presence. They walked through the apartment, tracing the space with quiet wonder, as if measuring the world I had built without them. I served tea, and for the first time in years, we sat together without pretense. The silence that had once separated us now felt different, not the heavy silence of avoidance, but the gentle quiet of understanding. They told me their father had moved to a smaller place across town. My sister, their aunt, was no longer part of his life. They stopped talking months ago, my daughter said softly. He doesn't even say her name anymore. There was no triumph in her tone, no satisfaction, just fatigue, as if she had finally grown too tired to hate anyone. We talked for hours, though the words themselves were simple. We avoided the past, not out of denial, but because we no longer needed to dissect it. Every glance, every pause carried everything words could not. When they left that evening, my son hugged me longer than I expected. He whispered, barely audible, "We know now, Mom. You were the only one who told the truth." That night, for the first time in years, I cried, not from pain but from release. The tears came quietly, like rain that has waited too long to fall. They washed away something heavy, something that had clung to me since the day I found that photo on the tablet. The ache didn't vanish, but it softened. Forgiveness, I realized, doesn't come as a single decision. It arrives in small, hesitant gestures, a visit, a letter, a hug that lasts a second longer than expected. As weeks turned into months, their visits became frequent. Sometimes we cooked together, sometimes we said nothing at all. The world outside still carried echoes of the scandal, but inside these walls, those echoes faded. We had built something new, fragile, but real. A different kind of family, one not built on illusion but on shared scars. And yet, beneath that peace, I felt another truth stirring, one I hadn't wanted to face. In freeing myself from betrayal, I had also inherited solitude. Independence had become my identity, but it had also become my armor. I had forgotten what it meant to trust someone again. Every act of kindness felt suspicious, every smile a potential deception. My revenge had protected me, but it had also fenced me in. I began to wonder what my life would look like if I allowed softness back in. Could love exist after betrayal? Could a woman who had built her freedom from ashes ever open her heart again? The thought scared me more than the memories ever did. Because healing, I realized, is far more terrifying than revenge. Revenge requires control. Healing requires surrender. That realization came to me one evening while walking through the park. I'd passed a small family, a woman pushing a stroller, a man carrying a picnic basket. They laughed about something simple, something ordinary. I didn't feel bitterness, only curiosity. I wondered if that kind of peace could ever be mine again. Not the peace of perfection, but of acceptance. The peace of letting life happen without needing to control its every outcome. When I returned home that night, I found another letter waiting at my door. This one wasn't from my children. It was from a name I hadn't seen in years, Rachel. My sister's handwriting was the same, elegant, practiced, the kind of penmanship that belonged to someone who always wanted to be admired. My heart tightened as I opened the envelope. The letter was short. She wrote that she was sick, that she didn't expect forgiveness, but she wanted to explain, that she wanted me to know she never meant for it to go as far as it did, that she envied the strength I had found after everything fell apart. She ended with a single line, "If I disappear, remember that you were always the stronger one." I folded the letter carefully and placed it inside my journal. I didn't feel rage or pity, just a strange distant sadness, the kind reserved for people who had already become ghosts in your life long before they were gone. That night, I stood by the window again. The city lights shimmered like old secrets. My reflection stared back, older, yes, but unbroken. Around me, the world was quiet, the kind of quiet that no longer frightened me. I realized that silence wasn't my punishment anymore. It was my inheritance, and it was finally mine to keep. The letter from Rachel sat on my nightstand for days, unopened after the first reading, yet impossible to ignore. It felt alive somehow, as if her presence had crept through the envelope and now lingered in the corners of the room, whispering reminders I didn't want to hear. Every night before bed, my eyes would drift to it, to the clean white paper folded neatly inside. Her words haunted me not because they were emotional, but because they were unfinished. If I disappear, the phrase clung to me like a question. I didn't respond immediately. I told myself that silence was a kind of justice, that her suffering, whatever form it took, was the natural consequence of her choices. But human hearts are rarely consistent with human logic. Anger may freeze us for a time, but memory always thaws the edges. In the mornings, while sipping coffee, I would find myself remembering her laughter, the kind that once filled our kitchen before everything went wrong. She had always been the free spirit of the family, the one who loved recklessly, lived impulsively, and believed that consequences were for other people. I used to envy that about her. I used to protect her from her own carelessness, until she used that same recklessness to destroy me. Now, years later, her words reached me from a place of weakness rather than defiance. And that, more than anything, unsettled me. A week passed before I found the courage to search her name online. It was late at night. The apartment was dark except for the blue glow of the laptop screen. The search results came slowly, fragments of her life scattered across digital traces. A social media account long inactive, a brief mention in a local newspaper from another city. Then finally, a post on a community page. Fundraiser for Rachel M. treatment support needed. The comments beneath it were sparse, polite, and distant. People had grown weary of her. The post mentioned a diagnosis, metastatic breast cancer. Stage 4. I stared at the screen for a long time. It wasn't pity I felt, at least not at first. It was disorientation. The sister I had hated, envied, mourned, and exiled had become mortal again, fragile, human, no longer the villain who had taken everything from me, but a woman facing the kind of ending that dissolves all illusions of power. The next morning, I found myself standing in front of the mirror, studying my own reflection. I tried to imagine what forgiveness might look like on my face. Would it soften me? Would it make me weaker? I wasn't sure. I only knew that the woman staring back wasn't angry anymore. Just tired. For days I debated what to do. I could throw the letter away, pretend I never read it, pretend she was already gone, but something deeper resisted that choice. Not because I wanted to absolve her, but because I wanted to absolve myself. Carrying hatred for so long had made me sharp, but it had also made me heavy. I didn't want to die someday with that weight still pressing on my chest, so I wrote her back. The letter was brief. No accusations, no sentimentality, just truth. Rachel, I received your letter. I don't know what to say that would make sense after all these years. You took from me something I can never recover, not the marriage, but the trust I once had in family. But I also know that life punishes us in ways no one else can. If you need help, tell me where you are. If you don't, I will still pray for your peace. I mailed it without return expectations. I didn't want to reopen the past. I just wanted to close the wound. 2 weeks later, an unfamiliar number called my phone. I almost didn't answer. But something, instinct maybe, made me pick up. A nurse's voice, gentle but detached. She asked if I was related to Rachel. I said yes. Rachel had been admitted to a hospice center 2 towns away. The nurse said my letter had reached her, and she had asked if I might visit. She doesn't have much time, the nurse said softly. She wanted to see you. If you're willing. I hung up without answering. My hands trembled. I stood by the window, staring at the pale sky, unsure whether the tears forming in my eyes were anger or mercy. Visiting her would mean reopening a door I had locked years ago. But if I didn't go, that door would remain locked forever, with both of us trapped behind it. The next morning I drove. The hospice was quiet, tucked behind a small church at the edge of town. The building smelled faintly of antiseptic and lavender. Nurses moved with the careful grace of people accustomed to grief. They led me to her room, a small, sunlit space overlooking a garden. Rachel lay in bed, frail and pale, her once vibrant hair now thin and colorless. The sight struck me like a physical blow. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. She looked up when I entered, her lips curling into something between surprise and relief. Her voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. "I didn't think you'd come." I didn't speak. I just pulled a chair beside her bed and sat. The silence between us, the same silence that had once been punishment, now felt sacred. She spoke in fragments. About her illness. About regret. About how she had believed she loved him, only to realize it wasn't love at all, just a need to feel chosen, even at someone else's expense. She said she thought of me often. That the moment she heard about the house, she knew I had finally found the strength she always lacked. I listened. Not to forgive her, but to witness her humanity one last time. When she began to cry, I reached out instinctively and took her hand. Her skin was cold, her fingers trembling. For years, I had imagined this moment as one of triumph, my chance to look her in the eye and make her feel the pain she caused me. But sitting there, I realized there was no triumph left to claim. There was only two sisters, broken in different ways, trying to recognize each other through the wreckage of their choices. We didn't talk about him. He didn't deserve space in that room. This was only about us. Before I left, she whispered something I'll never forget. "You rebuilt yourself from the fire I started." "I'm glad you did." I squeezed her hand gently and walked out without looking back. When I reached the car, the tears finally came, quiet, unstoppable, cleansing. They weren't for her, not entirely. They were for the years we had both wasted hating each other when all along, life had been waiting for us to simply let go. Rachel died a week later. The nurse called to tell me, her voice soft, practiced, like someone who had delivered this news many times. There was no funeral, just a cremation and a small scattering of ashes in the hospice garden. I didn't attend, but I visited the garden a few days after. I stood under a tree, watching sunlight dance through its leaves, and whispered a simple goodbye. It wasn't closure I felt, it was completion. The past had finally ended. And in its place, something new, fragile, uncertain, but real, began to grow. The lake had been the setting of the photograph that started it all, the single damning image that cracked open the illusion of my marriage. For years, I avoided thinking about that place. Even hearing the word lake in conversation used to twist my stomach. But after Rachel's death, something inside me shifted. The hatred I had clung to for so long was gone, burned out, leaving only quiet curiosity in its place. It was early autumn when I decided to drive there. The air had begun to cool, the leaves turning rust and gold. I told no one where I was going. My children didn't ask questions anymore. They had learned that some journeys belong to silence. I packed light, a thermos of coffee, an old sweater, a single photograph, the one my daughter had sent months ago of her and her brother standing in front of our old house. The drive took 3 hours. The road was familiar but distant, like a melody I hadn't heard since childhood. Every mile carried echoes of memories I had tried to bury. The last time I had seen the lake, my husband had claimed he was there alone. To think, in reality he had been with Rachel. That image, their reflection on the water, my children in the background, had haunted me through every sleepless night that followed. When I arrived, I almost didn't recognize the place. The once pristine dock was weathered and half collapsed. The small boathouse at the edge of the shore was peeling with faded paint. Even the water seemed duller, as if it too had grown weary from holding secrets. Time had done to this place what vengeance had done to me, stripped it of beauty but left it standing. I walked to the dock slowly, the boards creaking beneath my feet. The air was sharp with the scent of pine and decay. I sat down at the edge, letting my legs dangle above the still water. The reflection staring back at me was older now, calmer, and unmistakably my own. For the first time, I saw myself here not as the betrayed wife or the avenger, but as a survivor who had finally come full circle. For a long time, I said nothing. The lake didn't need words. It had heard enough lies to last a lifetime. Instead, I closed my eyes and listened to the rustle of leaves, the soft lap of waves, the distant call of a bird I couldn't name. Nature, indifferent to human heartbreak, went on breathing around me. In that stillness, I began to remember things I had long suppressed, small, ordinary moments that had existed before everything soured. The family picnic on this very shore when my children were little. The way my husband had once carried our son on his shoulders while my sister laughed beside me. Before the affair, before the lies, before the rot set in, there had been innocence here. And for the first time, I allowed myself to grieve not just for what I lost, but for what once was. Grief is strange that way. It doesn't always arrive when the loss occurs. Sometimes, it waits until you're strong enough to face it. As the sun began to lower, I reached into my bag and took out the photograph. My children's faces stared back, older now, wiser, but still carrying traces of the innocence I had once fought to protect. I placed the photo on the dock beside me, holding it down with a small stone to keep the wind from carrying it away. I did what I had to, I whispered to the water. The words weren't an apology. They were acknowledgement. For years, I had built walls inside myself, layers of bitterness, righteousness, and justification, all to avoid feeling the raw truth that every choice I made had been born from love. Twisted love, bruised love, angry love, but love nonetheless. I had punished to protect, destroyed to preserve. And though my methods had been cold, my reasons had always been human. The sun dipped lower, painting the lake in hues of amber and red. For a moment, I imagined Rachel sitting beside me, her hair catching the light like it used to, her laughter echoing across the water. It wasn't guilt I felt then. It was understanding. We had both been victims of the same delusion that love could erase selfishness. It never could. It only hides it until the truth demands payment.